Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is award-winning investigative journalist Tristan Ahtone. Tristan, who is a member of the Kiowa Tribe, has worked for National Geographic, NPR, Al Jazeera, and more. Tristan is the editor-at-large for Grist, a non-profit, independent media organization dedicated to telling stories of climate solutions. He's the former president of the Native American Journalists Association. Tristan, thanks so much for being with us this week.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
It's been a while since we've had a journalist from south of the Medicine Line. Last year we had Aaliyah Chavez and Mark Trehant, and Mark basically predicted the insurrection at the Capitol building months before it happened, so you can check that episode out in our archives. But anyways, that's to say that a lot has seemingly changed since then. There's a new president in the White House, a record number of Indigenous candidates elected. One of them has become the first cabinet minister. Do things feel like they've changed?
Yeah, I think on its face, things have changed. Deb Haaland, who you're referring to there, has made some pretty major strides as Secretary of the Department of Interior, bringing Indigenous concerns to the forefront. However, I do think it's important to note that she's likely in an unenviable situation of sort of balancing tribal sovereignty against the interests of the administration. And I think, like previous administrations, its interests often run counter to those of Indigenous nations, particularly in the area of oil and gas development and infrastructure. But also, you mentioned that Mark had come on here and predicted the 6th insurrection. I'll just lower your expectations a little bit, because I'm not sure if I can predict anything to the degree of accuracy that Mark Trehant can, but I'll give it the old college try.
Well, and hopefully nothing like that will be happening again. And you know, it is a balancing act for Secretary Haaland. Be the same here as having an Indigenous person running Indigenous affairs. There was a lot of hype about Haaland and being the first person to hold a cabinet position. Do you think she has lived up to some of that hype?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on your interest, but in short, Haaland's become a bit of an icon. From her appearance on the cover of InStyle magazine to her face-to-face meets with tribal governments and representatives, it looks like she's prioritizing the voices of Indigenous people. But again, I think it's important to note that she is working inside the federal government. And it's, I would say, unfair, if not maybe even a little bit dangerous, to believe that she can kind of move that system to a place that also prioritizes Indigenous voices and concerns.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things there seems to be movement on, where we had an issue here and a national inquiry, and that is missing and murdered Indigenous people, although I believe this was initiated under Trump. But like I said, we had a national inquiry here that resulted in calls for justice that have largely been ignored by the federal government. Can you kind of give us an idea of what's happening with this in the U.S.?
Yeah, a little. A number of states have begun to pass bills to investigate or deal with missing and murdered Indigenous people here in the U.S. However, likely the biggest problem that lawmakers and law enforcement have are systems that basically don't communicate with each other. So from federal agencies like the FBI down to local sheriff's offices, there's just really no coordination. So at least from my perspective, where y'all appear to have the information, names of people who have disappeared, relevant data, how cases were handled, et cetera, and an infrastructure to at least somewhat critically interrogate handling of these cases. Mm-hmm. In the U.S., we really don't have anything like that, or even remotely resembles a sort of centralized repository to put momentum behind dealing with this. So we're seeing a lot of movement, at least at the state level, some from the federal, but there is a fairly large task of trying to pull all of those data centers together in a way that will actually serve Indigenous people. And I hate to be a pessimist, but I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen anytime in the near future.
All right. As you're also certainly aware, First Nations in Canada have discovered hundreds of potential unmarked graves at the sites of former residential schools. A comprehensive review of the legacy of federal Indian boarding schools has also been announced by Secretary Holland. Can you tell us a bit about federal boarding schools?
Yeah, in terms of actions that are being taken and reviews right now, I haven't followed it super closely, but in April of last year, Deb Haaland announced that the federal government would launch an investigation into Native American boarding schools. And from what I understand, that investigation will include compiling and reviewing records to identify boarding schools and possible burial sites. But I don't know how long the initiative will take, but I do suspect it will take a few years to do the work. Obviously, it's complicated work that has to be done, and I think we're all eager to see where that initiative does go over the next couple of years.
From what I understand, hundreds of thousands of people attended these schools. Is there a lot of interest in what could happen here with this investigation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in the past, Indigenous nations here have taken concerns to the United Nations about dealing with missing children and family members. I think that obviously that information and that investigation is of high importance to Indigenous communities around the country. Again, what comes out of that is going to be the big question there. I mean, identifying names and tribal affiliation of many of the children who were disappeared into the boarding school system is critical, I think, in looking at that past and dealing with it. But how the information will be used is a different story. As you all know, government reports calling for change in Indian country kind of rarely go answered. So I'll be curious if this investigation meets a similar fate when it's completed. But at least starting in a place where we know where these places are, where those burial sites are, and where those children are and their names, I think is a good start, at least for our communities.
I'm for some reason on the email list for the Department of the Interior, so I get a lot of these emails, and there's also been efforts, to review and replace derogatory names from federal lands. We hear of efforts to protect and preserve Indigenous languages. What do you anticipate, I guess, for at least the next 2 years of this government and efforts to be made?
Well, I guess I anticipate conflict. I mean, Holland has undertaken efforts to remove place names that are primarily derogatory toward Indigenous women. And I think we're still in early stages of that process. But, I also think it's important to remember that, settlers love their place names and they fight for them. They're at least here in the U.S., there's been a hard fight over critical race theory in schools and book banning by Republicans. The idea that there could be some sort of counter mapping, to include Indigenous place names and removing those names, I think is actually going to be a fairly hard fight down the line. But again, still kind of in early stages of that. And I think exciting work to really start thinking about what that landscape can look like in the way that we call places and the names we use.
Tristan, we got to step aside for a quick break, but then we're going to talk more about your work and some of the other things that you have going on. We're just going to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is award-winning journalist Tristan Ahtone. And Tristan, maybe just a little on how and why you decided on a career in journalism.
Well, short answer is I just kind of fell into it. Long answer is I originally went to college at the Institute of American Indian Arts for painting. And got enrolled in a journalism course while there, and just found that I really loved it. Also figured out that I was a really bad painter. So those two things kind of collided at the same time, and lucky for me, figured out that I enjoyed journalism. So basically it was a class that I was forced to take, and then found that I enjoyed it.
Funny how that works sometimes. What are some of the challenges of reporting in Indian country, maybe that you've encountered, but also, mainstream coverage?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that Indigenous reporters have to deal with down here right now is just misinformation.
Mm.
I mean, and I think much of that comes from mainstream coastal newsrooms that have interest in nationalizing coverage, and often sort of boil down stories or communities into representations that come off almost as stereotypes. The other issue I think that a lot of these organizations have is that they're usually between 6 months to 2 years late to stories from Indigenous communities. So for a lot of my colleagues and other reporters that I work with, they're often being asked to cover stories that are to some degree fairly stale, or that some editor just recently stumbled on. So I think that raises a question about who that coverage is for and why it's being done. So I think that underlies a larger issue of who's it for, why is it being done, is it for us, is it by us? And that opens a lot of questions about journalism just generally.
As we mentioned, you've written for some of the biggest news organizations in the world. Do you think that coverage of Indigenous issues has improved some?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, they're sort of doing the bare minimum now. I started about 15 years ago, and back then editors would actually debate if they needed to do another Native American story, since they had already done one earlier in the year. Nowadays, those same places want a lot more content and a lot more stories from Indian country, but they a lot of times, as I said, they want you to do a story that they saw someplace else. So I guess to some degree that's progress, but I guess bottom line for me is that until major outlets really adopt Indigenous affairs desk models and hire Indigenous reporters, I think they're doing a disservice to audiences and sources and communities. I really think it's a matter of sort of morals and ethics, and I sort of think those are things that a lot of newsrooms are kind of lacking in.
Well, I want to discuss work that you had done that has appeared in the New York Times. That was about who paid for America's universities. Can you tell us a bit about what you uncovered there?
Yeah, that story in particular you're referring to was an op-ed that my reporting partner, Dr. Robert Lee, and I published on the heels of our investigation land grab universities. So basically, start with the Times. The New York Times had put out a piece sort of lauding the foundation of land grant universities here in the United States, sort of as an example of American values. And shortly before that came out, Dr. Lee and I had conducted an investigation at High Country News, looking at land grant universities, and basically found that the universities in question that are sort of being lauded by the Times took nearly 11 million acres of Indigenous land from about 250 Indigenous nations through about 160 violence-backed treaties. So we kind of took an opportunity to clap back at the Times and correct the narrative a little bit. But that comes as part of a larger sort of package of stories that we did around our investigation in land grant institutions here.
What was the reaction to that reporting?
Well, quite a lot. Right now, we've seen a lot of movement from some of these institutions to set up investigations into their own land grant dealings. For instance, Ohio State has partnered with First Nations Development Institute to come up with a reconciliation plan to work with Indigenous nations in the area that were affected by the institution. Cornell University has set up a site and an investigation into its own land grant dealings. We're basically into now institutions taking on the sort of investigative work on their end to come up with plans to address the reporting, or in most cases ignore the reporting. But we have seen quite a bit of traction in terms of really surprisingly changing the narrative, I think, around land grant institutions and their participation in essentially violent colonialism.
Are there calls from tribes for some of this land back? Is that something that's being looked at?
Yeah, some. I mean, I think University of California has really kind of led the way in thinking about how a land back situation could work, especially with California's land grant institution there. I mean, the problem that you always run into, right, is how would that even work? But I think that we're seeing Indigenous educators and scholars really thinking through, like, here are some examples of how churches have given land back, how counties have given land back, how federal agencies have done that as well, and essentially coming up with a model that would more or less work for a lot of these institutions, as many of them still own a lot of this land that was originally granted from those tribes and still make money off of them. In many cases, I think the sort of the ground level we've seen in terms of reaction is that Indigenous students should be receiving free tuition to land grant institutions. That seems to be sort of a common theme across the system. But in each state and in each university, those reactions have been a little bit different, and we kind of continue to monitor and see where folks are going with stuff. But we envision sort of a long tail on the story, and really proud of the impact that it's had so far.
Do you think these conversations would be happening without your reporting, but also 10, 15 years ago? Would universities be entertaining these ideas?
Yeah, probably not. I mean, I can't I can't say that it's like our reporting that brought this conversation along. Obviously, a lot of other scholars and especially Indigenous scholars have been having these conversations for a while. I think what's different about what we were able to do, again, my partner, Dr. Lee, and I, was be able to run some data analysis that we couldn't have done 15 years ago. The technology just was not to a point that we could have done the work that we did. So, part of this has been a change in access to tech and analysis that we can do with it. But again, being able to sort of like pull that information together and make sure that it was open source so that educators and academics could have access to all of the documents, all of the shape files, all of the data that we used, we really hope pushes that conversation a lot further, because essentially what we're doing is compiling the receipts. And it's much harder to sort of ignore the actual documents that you've got from a university. Well, I say it's much harder. They've done a pretty good job of ignoring it, but it makes it a lot easier on academics to be able to track down everything and be able to show that chain of sort of ownership moving hands from Indigenous communities to universities, and discussing what you do once you've got that concrete evidence.
Well, really important work, and you can check that out over on Tristan's website. Tristan, much more to talk about here. We just got to step aside for another quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is editor-at-large for Grist, investigative journalist Tristan Ahtone. Tristan, before the break, we were talking about an investigation you did into who paid for America's universities. You're also the founder of the Indigenous Investigative Collective, a network of Indigenous reporters and newsrooms working together on projects that span the globe. Can you tell us about anything the collective may be working on?
To some degree, we've been focused on handling of COVID-19 down here in the U.S. So obviously a lot of work around filing public records requests, working with sources around stories that we're interested in pursuing. Sorry to speak vaguely, but also, speaking with our colleagues in other parts of the world too on some larger collaborative projects. We keep most of it kind of close to the chest, I guess you could say, but we're really dedicated to trying to shed light on stories that really hold folks accountable, either at within our communities or at the federal government level. Really doing work that hopefully gives people the information they need to make some tough decisions.
Well, looking forward to what does come. Grist, where you work now, is very much focused on the environment, and of course, we've gone from a global pandemic that still hasn't gone away. And now we're we've got a focus on a war, and there's not a lot of focus, it doesn't seem to be, on the environment. You know, we had a UN report come out yesterday that has pretty much been met with silence. What do you see is the threat there?
Well, you know, war isn't good for anybody. But, you know, in terms of sort of looking at how this is going to play out in the immediate, you know, obviously oil and gas infrastructure here in the U.S. is really being eyed as key to sort of dealing with Russia. You know, the big thing I think that we have to be thinking about here is how that's going to impact Indigenous communities who are already fighting pipelines and oil and gas infrastructure. I suspect that's going to mean pushing a lot more permits for everything from drilling to construction. But you know, generally there's, as I said, I think a lot of the environmental costs are being downplayed or ignored. And when we're looking at sort of the future of environment and the globe, yeah, the IPCC report is absolutely critical to, I think, our understanding and dealing with this situation, which the window continues to close, and taking real action to fix the climate crisis. That focus on war is obviously sucking a lot of air out of the room, and rightfully so. But you know, these are sort of interconnected events that I think we need to be thinking about critically for you know, 50, 100 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Tristan, what are some of the things you think we should be paying attention to up here south of the Medicine Line?
Yeah, like I said, pipelines, oil and gas infrastructure, it's going to be an ongoing issue. You know, the Indian Child Welfare Act is an important piece of legislation down here that protects Indigenous children from being adopted out of their communities. It's going to the Supreme Court because it's being challenged by right-wing interests in an attempt to make sure that Indian children can still be adopted out or taken from their communities, and undermining tribal sovereignty. You know, we've been looking at ongoing legal fights ranging from, you know, the rights of nature to treaty violations. You know, the battles down here are really happening a lot in the courts, much of the time, but obviously that doesn't mean that it doesn't end up in the proverbial streets.
So much of the same issues we're dealing with up here. Tristan, you know, we mentioned you're the former president of the North American or Native American Journalists Association, which the conference will be here in Winnipeg next year. Hopefully we'll be able to see you then.
Yeah, hopefully.
Do appreciate you taking some time for us this week, Tristan. That is all the time we have, unfortunately, for this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. Of course, this episode and all of our past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. And do head over to Tristan's website. Just Google Tristan Ahtone, and you'll find some of his great work there that we talked about here today, including all that work on who paid for American universities. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. Have a great night. We'll see you back here on Face to Face next week.